Well, good morning, first of all, and welcome to One Bryant Park. On behalf of my colleagues and our longstanding partner, the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, or C2ES, I want to thank all of you for coming this morning. The bank's very pleased to again be part of Climate Week New York City and to have the opportunity to host this very special event. Today we are supporting C2ES in their launch of a new report called Weathering the Next Storm, a closer look at business resilience. This research is actually the product of several years of collaboration among teammates at C2ES and Bank of America. So I think it's only appropriate that we actually start our gathering by thanking and recognizing those teammates. I would start by thanking Janet Peace, who is the head of policy and business strategy at C2ES and with whom we've worked for many years. And thank Katie Marr, who I don't know where she is, right? Oh, she's over here taking pictures, who is a science fellow and actually worked with Janet on authoring the piece. And I would also thank Bob Perciasepe, who is the new president of or I guess not quite so new, president of C2ES, for his leadership and engagement in this project. From the Bank of America team, I cannot thank enough Kai Jensen and Bonnie Ben-Hayen for having with C2ES the vision behind this research and for making sure that it came to fruition from our part. And I would also thank Caitlin Latter, who's somewhere out there, for organizing this event this morning. You may be aware that the research that is being released today is actually a follow-up to a report that we partnered with C2ES to issue in 2013. That first report set out quite simply to answer the question of whether companies viewed climate change as a risk. What we found, even 2 years ago, is that the answer was a resounding yes. The vast majority of companies that we surveyed, 90%, believed at the time that climate change posed a risk to their facilities and operations, their supply and distribution chains, to their customers and their employees. And in following up on that research, we found that that percentage has not only stayed consistent, but has grown. So this new report that we're issuing today goes even further. It explores not just whether companies view climate change as a risk and something that they need to address, but it looks at how companies are identifying and how companies are preparing for climate risk. It looks at what's keeping companies from doing more in this space. And then really importantly, it also presents ideas for better collaboration among companies and governments to address climate change on a more systematic level and build resilient communities and build resilient economies. So just to give you a sense of our agenda today, we're going to have Bob Perciasepe come up in a few minutes to review the findings of the report. We'll also hear from Amy Luers, who's the Assistant Director for Climate Resilience and Information at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Amy is going to talk about why climate action is essential and what the White House is doing to help cities and companies manage climate risk. And then I'm really excited to welcome peers of mine from other institutions, other companies, who will provide examples of the types of climate risks that they're seeing within their own institutions and what they are doing in the area of climate resilience. So we welcome today Roberta Barbieri, who is the Global Environmental Director for Diageo. We welcome Jay Bruns, who I've lost, but is the Environment Champion at the Hartford, and Melissa Lavinson, who's the Corporate Sustainability Officer for PG&E. I can't thank Roberta, Melissa, and Jay enough for actually coming and sharing some of their personal and their institutional experiences with us. So to speak for just a minute about what we're seeing here at Bank of America, we have been focused for more than a decade on mitigating the causes of climate change, as I'm sure have many of your institutions. And in fact, those actions are starting to seem more and more like table stakes to many of us, although I should note that they were not table stakes when we set out goals and programs and initiatives. We here at the bank have reduced our carbon footprint of our operations by nearly 40% over the past decade. We have worked with our vendors to help them understand their own emissions and report on those emissions and set goals to reduce their emissions. We have programs that incentivize actually our employees to put solar on their roofs or to buy hybrid cars. And most importantly, because we're a financial institution, we have dedicated a significant amount of financial and intellectual capital to helping our clients to advance and install and develop renewable energy, energy efficiency, and other low-carbon technologies. We've dedicated over $40 billion to that effort since 2007, and we have re-upped our commitment in a much bigger way with our new $125 billion by 2025 goal. And we'll continue to focus very aggressively across all parts of our enterprise on the critically important task of climate change mitigation. But unfortunately, as today's report highlights, as other reports highlight, climate change is not some far in the future scenario anymore. We are already seeing its early impacts, and we are already starting to plan for its present and near future impacts. So just like PG&E and Diageo and the Hartford, and I'm sure many of your institutions, Bank of America is increasingly focused on identifying, understanding, and planning for climate change impacts across our enterprise. And as we've worked to explore these potential impacts on our business activities, on our operations, on our supply chains, we've found an interesting dichotomy. And I'd be interested to see if we've seen this at other institutions that we'll talk here today. On the one hand, because we are a large company and we're a large financial institution, we have incredibly well-developed business continuity and broader resilience plans in place. We have many, many people within our institution that are focused on risk and how to manage and mitigate risk within our institution. So the good news has been, the real positive has been, that as we've started to reach out over the past several years and engage those teams in thinking about climate change risk, those conversations actually have been pretty easy because we have people who are very much focused on that type of risk management, that type of business continuity and resilience. What I would say on the other hand, the dichotomy part is what has been really challenging, and I don't want to steal any of Bob's thunder, so I will not, is that we have found many of the same challenges that I think the institutions that talk here today, certainly Bob will highlight from the report, in actually identifying those climate change risks and preparing our institutions for them. Everything from a lack of really specific local information to inconsistency in the projections of what the climate impacts will actually be at a local, or regional, or broader level, to just peeling apart the onion of the complex interdependencies between public and private infrastructure and resiliency programs. So all of those challenges clearly present difficulties in terms of planning for climate change risk, but I think also present a huge opportunity for all of us to collaborate, to work together more closely. And it's really one of the reasons that we are supporting research, like the fantastic research that C2ES has done in this space, that we will continue to bring together gatherings like this so colleagues can talk across groups, across industries, and across companies, that will work to highlight best practices in this space, because we have a firm belief that all of this will help to, first of all, increase broad awareness of the need for climate resiliency and managing these risks really carefully within our institutions. It will help to create really important collaboration, and I know Amy will talk about this later as well, and as will Bob and others, collaboration between governments and companies and other stakeholders within local communities. And it will help essentially create a much stronger, it will drive organizations to have a stronger foundation of data upon which to build, all of us can build to promote climate resiliency within our organization. So we believe these types of efforts will just make us stronger and will help us all to build more resilient communities and more resilient economies going forward. So I want to thank again everyone who was involved in pulling together the research that's the foundation for our event today. Certainly thank again our tremendous partner in C2ES and all of my colleagues who will speak. And thank you again for coming and engaging in this important discussion with us this morning. So with that, I will turn it to Bob Perciasepe to look at the findings from our report.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to see you all here. And Alex, thank you for those comments. And thank you expressly for your partnership in this kind of research. It's an important area. And Bonnie Ben-Hayan, we really appreciate the work that you personally put in to helping us write this report. The Bank of America, as Alex mentioned, has been supporting this research for a while. And it's really an emerging and important area. There have been presidential task forces on this. There have been, which we may hear a little bit more about shortly, there have been many, many studies that have been done. And what we're trying to do is synthesize here, where are the major corporations in the world and what can we learn from that? Those of you unfamiliar with C2ES, which is a cute way to summarize the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank. And boy, we've been doing a lot of thinking about this. And, but our key approach is to bring diverse interests together. That's the juice that makes our analysis and work come to fruition and to build support. Especially, we like to bring businesses together with all their expertise and needs with governments, particularly cities and states. And you're going to hear that here in a moment. You know, the other thing I need to mention is that we are focused on climate and energy-related solutions. And I think we like that word in our title because solutions are something that often elude the body politic. And if we can udge it along a little bit further, that's what we like to do. And we think that this is a pretty important subject. Now, I want to say right at the onset, it's as important, if not more important, that we all continue to work together on mitigating the climate challenges we face. But as Alex mentioned, we're already facing some of the impacts of it and are likely to be facing them for quite some time. And so getting better at dealing with that, planning on it, and working on it is something that's pretty important to avoid the most costly impacts as we move forward. So with the bank's support, we've been able to look at how companies are preparing for climate risks, what's keeping them from doing more, and how companies and cities and local governments might work together to actually strengthen the work that they're both doing. And the way we went about doing this report is a mix of things that you would normally look at when you do research. We've looked at publicly available information, disclosures that companies make. We looked at major global companies, those that are on the Standard & Poor's Global 100 list. We also conducted in-depth interviews. We held workshops with cities and businesses together. We've talked to business leaders in many different companies, government officials, academics, and other environmental and natural resource manager stakeholders. Now, I brought a prop with me here. Hold on a second. I should have had it readily available. This is the executive summary, and we have it up in the back, so I hope you take it. The detailed report is available at, I know this is highly complex, c2es.com. I'm sorry, .org. See what happens when you work with a bank? I'm going to highlight some of those findings for you this morning that you'll find in that report. You know, as Alex mentioned, most major companies already recognize climate risks. And I think that this, on one hand, you may say, well, okay, I get that. They do that. But I don't want to gloss over this. This is significant. You know, business leaders do not have their heads in the sand when it comes to looking ahead on climate change. They get it. They see the climate risks firsthand, whether it's their facilities, whether it's interrupted power, whether it's their supply chains or their distribution chains, the impacts on their employees' lives. I think, Alex, it was meaningful that you mentioned how The bank is looking at their own employees and what they can do to help them on these issues. And we found that most companies, about 80% of them, currently report their climate risks on the CDP surveys, for example. And 40 to 50% are reporting them also on their sustainability reports or in their other risk management reports that Alex mentioned, like financial filings. So companies generally, and this is again, not to gloss this over, because there are many parts of our society that still aren't really focusing on these issues, but companies know about climate risk. The question is, what are they doing about it? And so let's talk about that a little bit. There, it's all on this itty-bitty little chart. That's it, not really. But most rely, and I think, again, Alex mentioned this, on existing risk management and existing business continuity efforts that are already underway. And why not? Because those are the parts of companies that understand the concept of risk. And so they are already trying to add this in this, that many of them are looking at this as a threat multiplier or magnifier, that exacerbates the risks that they already know and understand. This makes a lot of sense. But this lens puts climate change, while this lens puts climate change into a familiar context for most companies to work on, it can have some downsides. It could cause companies, for example, to overlook or underestimate the threats that they are facing. Climate change will be affecting things like sea level rise, precipitation, demand for heating, demand for cooling, frequency and severity of storms, and a lot of these risks are laid out in the report. I'm not going to go through the list, but examining these risks and thinking them through together with the other risks that are already familiar to most companies, particularly in their own arenas, you can start, if you don't, you will potentially miss the cumulative impacts or the indirect impacts that you don't expect. For instance, if you're in the agricultural supply business and you're supplying something to agriculture, you may say, all my facilities are just fine and dandy, but if 1 million acres in California is no longer in production because of a drought, there's a smaller market for you to be marketing to. So these indirect impacts are something that climate change, bringing climate change into your risk management planning is pretty important. So after talking to dozens of companies, we discovered that there really isn't one way, and this is not a shock either, that they have been going about doing this. And we're going to hear more about it from specific companies in a minute, but I'll mention it briefly here. There's sort of the top-down approach where companies broadly examine their climate risks. They look across their entire enterprise and what all the interconnections are. And we're going to hear from Diageo later in the morning here, a global company that makes beverages. They conduct an annual company-wide survey. They look across all their risks. They're in 30 different countries. They have water as a pretty important part and component of the beverages that they produce, and water protection, water efficiency, water treatment, drought-tolerant crops. All these things are those indirect and long-term impacts that you take into account that are additive and look at those cumulative risks. The second approach might be more viewed as a bottom-up, where you're a corporation, you have facilities geographically distributed around the world. Some of them may be more at risk than others, and you start to differentiate which ones are more at risk. And Anglo American is one of those companies that we highlight. It's a large mining operation, and they look at different parts of the world where they may be subjected to more risk, like they're looking in Brazil and South Africa, and they use broad climate data to help them design some of their projects. Now, although we see companies taking action and bringing this and incorporating it into their risk management regime, we also know and have found that there are quite a few obstacles that are in place to help them build more resistance and to do their plans. And these challenges are not insignificant, but they certainly, in our view, are surmountable. There's a lot of climate data. If you get into this and you start looking at what's available and have your staff looking at what's available, you're going to find a lot of data. But companies struggle to figure out, how do you connect the dots with all that data? And what part of that data, which might be global, is going to help me in my business decisions over here in this geography? And how do they narrow that global data down to a specific area? Some companies are looking at historic data to augment that. What has happened here in the past in this particular location, instead of trying to look at projections into the future? Then how would you overlay, an increased frequency of something into the future? The projections that we have globally are often difficult to zero in locally on a location-specific detail. And this is a major issue and a challenge that we all face in trying to plan for some of these impacts. And most business leaders, and I know this is not surprising at all, because if you're in business, this is what you do every day, but they need actionable science. What can science tell me that I can act on now to be better prepared? And so all this translation of this data into actionable items where they may have to make investments or be prepared in terms of how they conduct their business, all of that disrupts the regular flow of business. And so they really need to have that sense. There's also an inherent, and this goes to all risk management, but there's an inherent disconnect sometimes between the longer-term view you have to take on some of these risk management approaches and the day-to-day action and work that a business conducts. I need to get all these agricultural products into California. I don't know why I'm saying California today. I was just there the other day looking at the drought. So quite remarkable impact. And I'm not even talking about fires. So that disconnect on the planning horizons that businesses face and confront, I think is a concept. This is not only climate change. This is all risk management issues that businesses face. But climate change is particularly difficult, and it's a challenge here. And then the last thing I want to mention in terms of the challenges is that all the risks that a business may face are not something that's in their control. They cannot control whether or not the local power company is going to restore the electricity in a timely fashion. They may not know how long it's going to take the state highway department to reopen a bridge. And these issues, or when the water supply will be on again for producing a product, if water is part of your product production. So this is a pretty important piece of that challenge as well. So these are some of the challenges they face. So let's talk about some of our recommendations in face of that. So, anybody have a guess on that one? Those are boats in your neighborhood. That's a scene from New Jersey after Hurricane Sandy. And we can look at Hurricane Sandy as an example of why companies and communities need to work together. I'm just going to use a very simple, like, why didn't we think of that kind of an example that actually happened. But after Sandy knocked the power out, one of the biggest impacts of Sandy, in addition to a broad geography of tidal surge, was a huge geography of power outages because of the size of the storm. It may have been a Category 1 or 2 hurricane. We can all try to figure out what that means. But it was so big that the area was large. This was an unusual piece of the action on that storm. And so American Water, which is a private water company that operates a lot of local water supply, water treatment facilities in New Jersey, they had no power to run their water filtration plants to provide drinking water and finished water for businesses as well as families. And so they were able to deploy over 400 generators that could get their plants going. But they had no way to get the fuel. They couldn't get fuel for those pumps, or they had no place to store the fuel if the fuel could be moved. And so I was in the Situation Room at the White House during this event, and half of my time was spent trying to figure out how to get barges of fuel somehow into New Jersey. But what they ended up doing is partnering with the local governments who couldn't get the fuel they had out of the ground because they had no electricity. They were able to get together, find ways to store the fuel from trucks to other tanks that had capacity in it, and then they shared the fuel. So the emergency vehicles for the police and the fire had fuel, And the pumps that American Water needed to pump keep the drinking plant water going, they created this partnership for several weeks to continue those vital services. Now, they hadn't thought of that before the storm. They've been thinking about it more since the storm, but it shows you how sometimes these things pop up right in front of you when you have to solve the problem. But that's a good example of where you can now get ahead of the curve and try to see how to plan that in the future. And there are many other cities that are playing key roles in designing and working on critical infrastructure and looking at how to protect critical infrastructure. You've got New York, Boston, cities in California, Washington State, all over the country, cities are working on this, and they're developing these plans sometimes in partnership with various community associations, sometimes in partnerships with universities and other nonprofits, but very rarely, and let's say less common, cities and companies are partnering to get these plans done, and we think that this is a big missed opportunity. So cities often have more user-friendly data. That I was just talking earlier about one of the challenges is taking global data and try to translate it into actionable items. Sometimes cities have local data that is more locally specific that can be more helpful. Here in New York, for instance, they've created a panel on climate change that's developing city-level information about the climate variables that they have to use in their own planning processes. I bet that information would be helpful to businesses in the New York metropolitan area as well. In Philadelphia, private developers are working together with the city water department and some of the schools and neighborhood groups to develop green infrastructure. Those of you who don't know what green infrastructure is, it's a way to both do green up your neighborhood and make it more walkable and livable, but also help reduce the intensity of runoff during a rainstorm, keep some of the rainwater from getting into the sanitary sewers, which then causes them to overflow, and it's like the knee bone's connected to the shin bone. Before you know it, the Schuylkill River, you can't have a rowing contest in it. So that's a local joke for Philadelphia. So, but the idea is that they're working together with the business community and the local community and the local neighborhood community to come up with strategies that will make Philadelphia more resilient. And we'd like to see more of these partnerships. We'd like to be able to see how they can work together to analyze data, evaluate risk, do cost-benefit analysis, and implement planning. So let me wrap up here. There's no right path forward as we move forward to address, but there's a couple of things that I think are pretty obvious and clear from some of the work that we've done and the interviews done. You know, as you get into it, it can seem overwhelming. So some companies who are getting into it, they might want to start small. They may want to think about how they enter this whole area, a limited scope, limited vulnerability assessments, focusing perhaps on the most critical parts of their business, and in raising internal awareness, which Alex pointed out earlier. If you work with the risk management part of your organization, it often is the easiest way to do it. Not all companies are reporting their climate risks. And the degree that they are, there's a lot of variability in what it is and how well it's done. And one of the first steps in this is actually to recognize your risk enough that you actually report and talk about it publicly as well as internally. And so improving we think that government could also help people improve the quality of the reporting that is out there. They should also look at opportunities for coordination among governments and the private sector for both resilience planning, investments in the planning and analysis, as well as building resilient facilities. And we think what's most important here is that with many cities and companies recognizing their climate risks now, more so than ever before, it's time for them to build a new era of partnership on this particular issue. And we think that's a pretty important outcome from what we found. Now, I've done with my summary of the report. As I mentioned, the summary is out in the back for those of you who have not gotten it. And before I ask Amy Lewis to come up from the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, I thought it would be a good idea and we have several people with microphones on the sides of the the aisles here, and if people raise their hand, we can do a couple of questions that somebody may have. And I warn you and the people who work for me that if I don't understand the question or can't answer it, I will call on somebody to do that. That means you, Katie. Any questions for that? That was, that was like the 50-cent, summary right there.
Hey, good morning. My name is Carter Kraft. I work for the Office of the Consulate General of the Netherlands in New York City. We work in the northeastern part of the United States, and as someone who's lived in this area for 20 years, I see a big disconnect in terms of any progress on policy with climate in local and state government, between local and state government. So when you look at the electoral cycles, when the mayor comes up or when the governor comes up for re-election, when you look at the campaign cycles of when the new campaigns begin, there's been a disconnect between local and state land use policy, just for environmental goals, coastal zone management and everything else. So when I look around this little part of the Northeast, I wonder, are there other places in the US where cities and states actually work more constructively together to address some of the big picture issues you're discussing today? If you have any examples around the US or around the world where cities and states or cities and provinces or elsewhere actually work constructively together over time trying to get the politics out of it.
Well, just like I mentioned in a business environment where long-term planning sometimes is out of sync with their day-to-day business decision-making process, and there are challenges there. Local and state governments are not immune to these same forces, and I appreciate you bringing that up. I think many people, and this may shake your confidence a little bit, but many people do look to the New York area as having gotten their head ahead on this a little bit further ahead. If you look at the Northeast states in general, they've banded together on the mitigation side pretty intently with something they call the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So the rest of the country right now, as they're starting to look at how they mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, are looking to the Northeast, and New York State is a piece of that, and Connecticut as well, on how states can work together on mitigation. So I think here is an example for that. But on the resilience planning, I think we're all still trying to figure out how these partnerships should work. And from my own personal experience, although I don't think that this is laid out in the report, but from my own personal experience, I know that South Florida is really doing, it seems to have some degree of continuity at the local level, maybe not at the state level, looking at resilience planning. They're obviously looking at tropical storms as another particular issue, and as sea level rises, they're looking that there'll be more impact. So you have Miami, Dade County, Broward County, and I think the county to the south of Miami they have a climate group that is working pretty intently on this. So I would call your attention to that group and take a look at what they've been doing. They seem to have created an institution that transcends, but won't be it won't be necessarily immune from that election cycle, but it certainly seems to be transcending it right now. So I would give that as an example. But I would use your own area as an example on the mitigation side.
Hi, my name is Audrey Hornick-Becker. I work for the Environmental Defense Fund. My question is about thinking about your example that you gave earlier with fuel and the American Water and the state emergency police and fire. Is clean energy part of the resilience discussion here, or is it resilience in any resilience way? Or are businesses looking at ways to use clean energy or energy efficiency to make their businesses more efficient?
Yeah, I think there are two pieces of that. First, I think we all need to recognize that you can't just be doing resilience planning. You've got to be also working on the climate mitigation side. the issue of what do we do if there's a problem today, I mean, if there's a Hurricane Sandy or if there's a drought in California, you have to deal with those situations now. And in the recovery period, there's an opportunity to look at doing things differently going forward. And some of that is going on here in New York, and some of the planning that's going on post-Sandy. And I'm going to venture, and we have people here from California who will be on the panel, or at least their companies are in California. But I will believe that there'll be changes in California soon as well in terms of issues related to preparedness in some of the more drier parts of the state. They already are changing their land use practices and preferences. When I was out there last week, and some people here may be from California, and this is somewhat lighthearted, but it's a very serious problem. But you know, the whole thing about lawn care, their whole thing now is brown is the new green. So, or I have a crispy lawn. You know, so they're trying to change a little bit of how people think about those aspects. So these things are interwoven. But when something happens, you have to be prepared to deal with what you currently have as well. So you can't say, well, all the drinking water plants in New Jersey are running on, their emergency power is running on a diesel engine. There's not necessarily a way to deal with that in the short term, but there may be a way to deal with that in the long term. So I think that's where they merge together here.
Thank you. Emily Mazzacurati with 427. Thanks for a great report that really highlights some of the key developments. I was curious if you've had a chance at all to explore how companies outside of the Fortune 100 are preparing for climate risk. I think we would expect Fortune 100 companies to be better prepared and more knowledgeable. I'm wondering how steep you think that curve is when you drop beyond the 100 magic number. Thank you.
Yeah. Katie, I might have to ask you, can we bring the microphone over here for Katie for a minute? I know in our interview process we went beyond them, but I'm going to ask, and we've involved them in our workshop, smaller companies in our workshop, but I'm going to ask Katie to give an answer.
Yeah, so we had definitely talked to some smaller companies, but again, I think most of the companies we talked to are relatively large, but it did come up that, especially when talking to the cities, that small businesses are really a whole different ballgame because, you know, if a storm comes, they could be completely destroyed and not come back. So I think that is definitely a big problem, and we mentioned in the report that, you know, small businesses actually make up most of the economy of the U.S. So I think a lot of small businesses are joining together, especially in small cities, and creating kind of groups to address resilience and, you know, go to their town commissions and talk about zoning issues and things like that. So we've definitely seen that in some cities. And I think that's seems to be a trend across the U.S. at least, that some of these small businesses are joining together because it's really hard for them to address on their own. And I think that's the goal of a lot of these climate change commissions that are in California and Washington State and Detroit. They're kind of working with their local businesses to help them and work together on those things and sharing data and addressing resilience because, again, they just don't have the resources to do it on their own. So.
Thanks, Katie. I think that's a great question because as Katie just pointed out, you know, most of the economic activity is spread much more among smaller and smaller entities, from restaurants all the way to local manufacturing plants. And so I think the idea of how to proceed and how to partner, I think, is universal. So I hope that can be helpful to all businesses of all size.
Good morning. Good morning.
Hi.
Hi. My name is Ari Gerstmann. I'm with the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research. And you mentioned that businesses need actionable science. And you also talked a little bit about how when you try and apply the global models to local conditions, there are difficulties in interpreting any sort of meaningful result. So is there much evidence of businesses going directly to basic research, climate modeling, academic institutions and looking specifically at improving climate modeling writ large so that the science can be actionable?
Yeah, I think there are definitely examples of that. I mean, the example we have right here of Bank of America partnering with us to try to get a better handle on what people are already doing and what their barriers are is certainly part of a corporate and NGO relationship to try to move this issue forward. There are major companies, and I can't give you a citation here, that are funding research at universities as well in this arena. And I think we could find out some information on that if you would like, but there are certainly a significant amount of interaction going on that in improving models and predictions. And some of the companies are doing it themselves and may even have some proprietary information, but in general, I think there's a lot of activity going on at the research level. I think we can do one more question, and then we have to get on to our next speaker. Let's try to do somebody on this side. Well, you're in the middle. Maybe that's symbolic.
Hi, I'm Claire Ferguson. I work at CDP. And we love seeing the data, obviously, being used from CDP. And one of the questions I had, just sort of looking through the executive summary, is that it seems like you guys hit on data quality and granularity as a big issue that you're looking to improve on. And obviously, we're always trying to improve the data that we're getting from companies. So I was wondering if you could speak to some of your sort of dream data improvements. What are you looking to see? What are companies looking to see? Are you talking to cities that want to see something that we aren't providing? It'd be great to get some of that insight.
Well, we see this as an area of continuing research. I mean, we've observed that the reporting, I know this is right in your wheelhouse, that the reporting is uneven. You guys have a structured approach, and you don't get, even there, you don't get all the same kind of data. And so there are many different institutions that are out there. Yours is an important one, and we actually looked at all the data there as well. And so one of our recommendations is that the government, perhaps, and the government, what is that? Probably the federal government, but it could be states, a group of states as well. Really, we need to find a way, and again, this is the wheelhouse of the group that I have right now, is like we bring these different groups together to see how we can move this ball forward. So we may very well want to follow up on this recommendation with some companies and some federal agencies and some other NGOs to see if we can't figure out how we can improve that reporting. This is not, I think this is fundamental. It's not that hard necessarily, but it's a fundamental factor, and it'll be different for different size companies as well. So I think it's an important area to continue to work on. But one of our observations here is first of all, you don't have everybody reporting something, and the fact that everybody we looked at who is reporting, they're reporting things not in a completely compatible or integratable way. So, knowing where you are is a very important step in knowing where you need to go. So I think it's a good observation and something for us, I think, to all think about how we can improve it. So I'm going to stop there, but thank you so much for that question and all these questions. I wish I had more information to impart on you, particularly on the research question, but I just know that there's a lot going on, but we'll try to follow up on that. And Amy, I hope that maybe I could implore for you to come up and give us some views from the federal government. We've been involved with a number of events and efforts that the Office of Science and Technology Policy has had going on at the federal level. The climate assessment report that came out last year, actually, in my view, was one of the first reports that tried to get at least to regional level granularity, and so there's, we continue to move in that direction, and there's a lot of work going on at the federal government to try to coordinate between all the different federal agencies, as you might imagine, have lots of information and ideas.